Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Iris Fox, and I want to extend a warm welcome to the Rough Edges podcast. Rough Edges exists to provide mental health education as well as faith-based messages in order to inspire growth and foster healing. In this podcast, I will guide you through my faith and mental health journey to dispel the stigma surrounding mental illness and to create a voice for those who wish to discover more about these topics. My hope is that this podcast will not only shed light on mental health issues, but will also reveal the intersection between faith and mental illness in order to bring growth and healing in our communities. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Rough Edges. I am super duper excited for our guest for today. I'm going to introduce her. Her name is Julie A. Fast. So Julie is an author and researcher, and she is also the best-selling author of Take Charge of Bipolar Disorder, Loving Someone with Bipolar Disorder, Getting It Done When You're Depressed, and the Health Card System for Bipolar Disorder. She is the world's top online bipolar disorder author with over 15 million views of her blogs, essays, and articles. So big deal, guys. After many years of untreated symptoms, Julie was finally diagnosed with bipolar disorder and a psychotic disorder, also called schizoaffective disorder, at age 31. Julie focuses on brain health research and education and regularly trains healthcare professionals on the topics of bipolar disorder, psychosis, and substances that affect the bipolar brain. You can read more about Julie's work at juliefast.com. Welcome, Julie.
Hello, Sarah. It's wonderful to be here. I love it.
Yes, I am so excited to have you on the podcast. And so, before we dive into our topic for today, what are three things that you are most passionate about and why?
Writing. I think writing saved me. All of us who have an illness or who have experiences in life really need an outlet. And for me, I think writing about everything that goes on with my brain has been an amazing outlet. And that allowed me also to have a career because my bipolar and psychosis make it very difficult for me to work at a traditional job. So being able, once I was finally diagnosed, to say, maybe I could use my writing and my marketing skills and have a career. Second, I would say, without question, research. I never get tired of it. I never get tired of looking into the brain. I never get tired of writing books or reading about research. I just never get tired of it. It's a constant excitement of what's happening in our world. We are living at a time where things are changing pretty rapidly. Just look at AI, for example, and what's happening and how diagnosing is changing and all of that. And then finally, no question, relationships. I think we all get to a point, especially as we get older, that peaceful relationships are what get us through things. So peaceful relationships. I've learned to cultivate relationships with really stable people. And it changed my life in so many ways because I can now go to them and tell them what's happening. And I get an opinion that has nothing to do with having this wonky brain. And they'll go, no, that sounds normal to me. Or no, Julie, that's paranoia. So that's what I'd say. Writing, research, and relationships.
All right. I really love that. And I resonate with all of that because especially for me with writing, I love writing. I just can't get enough of it. And it actually helps me to be stabilized when I'm dealing with my mental health condition. But also I love that you put peaceful in front of relationships because yeah, we all need peaceful relationships and not the toxic ones. So,
yeah.
And
I look back, untreated, I had untreated bipolar for 15 years and my relationships were great in many ways, but my gosh, they were all over the place and they were often dangerous and I would leave and I would come back and all these, calls and worries and long letters and what happened and why don't you love me? And I don't have that in my life anymore. And that's a personal choice. It's been 20 years of 30 years of really hard work. I do not have stressful relationships in my life. Sometimes I'm a little more lonely than in the past because I had so many friends. But now I really sort of stick to the relationships that help me. And then, of course, I have to do that in return. I feel so much better able to go to bed without wondering about some guy or why my friend said this or who said that or who's trying to hurt me or who loves me. I feel a lot better having peace. Really
Mm.
big difference.
Yes, absolutely. I resonate with that completely because it's like you said, it's like it's kind of an energy drainer, to
And
just
I
have
was a
all
part
these.
of it too, right? It's my
Mhm.
responsibility to not be a part of one of those relationships. They're 50-50.
Right.
And I used to think it was a bit exciting. I don't find it exciting. No, it's not exciting. No,
Yeah, the drama, right?
no drama. No drama. The drama is I have enough drama in my head. It's in there all the time because I live with paranoia, right? I don't need
Mhm.
drama created by other people's problems. So
Yeah.
doesn't it make more sense to have relationships with people who talk, who don't give you the silent treatment, who aren't unkind, who will call you out if you're doing something they don't like? They don't disappear on you. It's so much better.
Yes, I definitely agree with you
Mhm.
on that. But today we are definitely discussing all about bipolar disorder, but specifically with your research in bipolar disorder, because you are like at the top of the line when it comes to bipolar research. And as a person who's been diagnosed with bipolar disorder back in 2021, I have been reading your book, Take Charge of Bipolar Disorder. That was actually the first thing that was recommended
Oh,
to me, yeah,
wonderful.
when I was leaving the hospital. So I am so excited to be getting into that tonight. And my first question would be, can you tell me a little bit more about your experience with mental health? I know we alluded to it in the beginning, but tell me about your experience and what made you choose to study bipolar disorder.
Well, I remember sitting in a bookstore in Hawaii when I was 16 years old. I lived there. I went to high school in Hawaii. And I'm sitting here and I remember exactly the book I was reading because I'm almost 60. So I was reading Far Side comic book and I heard a booming voice say, "You need to get out of here." And I
Mm,
looked around and I thought, is my dad calling me? There was nobody there.
mm,
And I got up and left. I remember walking places hearing, "You shouldn't be here." And I would look around and I had no idea what was going on. And it didn't even really scare me that much or upset me that much. I made the assumption everybody heard voices, that it was normal, and I would just get up and leave. Or I'd look around and go, "No, I'm not going to answer that today." Then the next year at 17, I took my first trip to Europe. And looking back, of course, I know what it was, but you'll understand this. I had the best time of my life. I got drunk for the first time. I fell in love for the first time. Everything was perfect. I lost weight. It was the greatest experience of my life. It was incredible. One of the teachers on the trip called me a foghorn and said I was the
mm,
loudest person he'd ever met in his life. And I laughed it off. I thought it was funny. I had no I just had no concept of who I was or what I was doing. And one of my best friends was on the trip and I ignored her for almost the whole trip. Of course, that
mm,
was my first manic episode. Then at 18, when I got back to college, to high school, I was sort of went back to being rather stable. And then at 18, I had a big manic episode and I went to a university where I did pretty well and then decided suddenly I would much rather live next to a hockey team. And I picked up and I left. I went across the United States up to a college that was not the right college for me. Never went to class because I was just all over the place. And I remember crying and not understanding what was going on. And some days I would like get a tray of glasses, like from the student union, like water glasses, and throw them at trees, or I would run around the building. But then when I
mm.
tried to go sit in school, I would cry and I couldn't work. So I went to the therapist because I knew something was wrong. It was 1982. Nobody knew anything about, stuff back then. And they just put me sort of in this group class. Didn't work. So I went up to Vancouver, BC and met my first boyfriend and left college and lived with him for a while. And until I realized that it wasn't going to work and he broke up with me, I went back and I'm 19 now, went into a massive suicidal psychotic depression, which I didn't know what it was. My first suicidal episode was at 19 and I was riding my bike. And I remember going, everything would be better if I just ran my bike in front of the bus. And I remember thinking, what's going on? Within literally a month, I was manic again. And I went and worked at a park, Glacier National Park in Montana. And that was the start of 15 years of constant rapid cycling mood swings. but nobody caught a lot of it because I constantly moved. I was all over the place. My mania was usually euphoric. So a lot of people thought I was just really intelligent and fun and crazy. And my depression, everybody just thought I had depression. I was finally diagnosed at age 31, but interestingly, it was after my then partner, Ivan, was diagnosed with bipolar the year before. So he was diagnosed in 94. And then I finally was diagnosed with bipolar in 95 after getting manic and getting on a plane and going to China with no plans. My mom, I learned to speak Mandarin Chinese in 4 weeks, and I am not joking. I have the proof. My mom came to find me because we didn't know what was wrong. We traveled around. I then got psychotic in Hong Kong, finally went back to Hawaii, was diagnosed with depression, put on Zoloft, which made me manic. Finally go back to my partner in Seattle. And in 20 minutes, Sarah, my first time ever with a psychiatrist, I was diagnosed with rapid cycling bipolar disorder with psychotic features, which was not correct. It's actually schizoaffective. 15 years of untreated. And there were no books on the market. There were no management books. And I had just gone through a year of this with my partner. And I remember saying, if I can figure out how to manage this illness, I'm going to write books about it. So your question of how did I decide to write about bipolar? Oh, no, I never would have decided that. That was put on me. I was already a writer and a marketer and a systems creator. And I had already done a lot of work in marketing and had worked as a teacher for many years. And so I finally just said, I'm going to combine those skills with my bipolar knowledge. And I had the first bipolar website that taught management. I wrote the first bipolar book, actually, the first management book. And that's where it started. But I would never say this was a choice. I think, I read quite a bit about your work, and we have this sort of put upon us. It's a genetic illness, and then we have to make the best of it. So I know there's many people out there listening to this, especially if they're my age, because I'm so much older than you are, which is we were just not diagnosed that much in the 80s. We just weren't diagnosed. And many of us lived for many, many years with serious brain illness without a diagnosis. So that's a long answer to your, how did I start my bipolar disorder world? And that's what happened.
Wow. First off, thank you for sharing that. And also, wow, I'm just blown away at the fact that there was barely any research at the time, no treatment plans really.
So I should say, because I should explain that I consider treatment to be medications, hospitals. There were no management plans. There were literally memoirs. In fact, Kay Redfield Jamison's amazing book, In Quiet Mind, had literally come out sort of right when I was diagnosed, which is amazing. But there were no management books. It was all about what is bipolar and pills. And because I'm quite medication resistant, I love meds and I take them when I can. I said something else has to be done. And that's when I started to write my system. It was around 1998.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow. And now everybody does management, everybody. But believe me, nobody talked about triggers before. No one ever taught me about sleep. No one talked about relationships or work or travel or circadian rhythms. No one ever sat down and gave me a list of what I needed to look for in order to stay stable. So I just created it.
Wow. I really admire that because it's kind of be the change that you want to see, right?
I was going to die. I mean, I don't think there's any question. I never thought I'd live past age 50. Never. But I had a system, and the system keeps me going. Even now, I have chronic bipolar. My bipolar is always here. I don't get a lot of relief, but it's nothing like it was, and I know how to control it. And I think the system saved my life, definitely.
Wow. I am very delighted to hear that, actually. And I thank God that you did develop a system to, kind of help you manage it, because it is difficult. I will say, extremely difficult.
Yeah. It's difficult. I don't think, Sarah, I think we live in a world where we're so concerned about stigma, and we're so concerned about everybody having equal rights, and, let's not trigger anybody, and let's not do this. And I'm quite liberal, and I'm all for being careful. I'm all for saying that, I'm about to talk about suicide, so be ready. But we've really reached a point now where we are not talking seriously enough about these illnesses. They are very, very serious. They can be managed. You and I are proof of that. But we're so scared now to talk about the truth. I talk about violence and aggression a lot in our illness. And believe me, the reason that 40% of people in jail have a diagnosed brain illness, such as bipolar, is because of the aggression that comes with our untreated illness. I just want us to talk about it more. That's why I'm always open about my really aggressive symptoms and my violent symptoms towards myself and others. These are intense illnesses. We don't have to be negative about it, but I hope we can be more honest about how they affect family and how they affect society.
Yes, absolutely. I definitely agree with that. And the fact that we don't often have honest conversations about it. And it's so interesting to me because we have open dialogue about the more generalized, like mental health conditions, like depression, anxiety. But when it comes to like the more severe aspects of mental health conditions, like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, even PTSD, and among many others, we just are very like tight-lipped about all of those things. And
Why do you think that is? So it's great to be able to talk to you about this. So all of those have a component of aggression and violence in them. Why do you think we all know it's there? Because there's nothing more violent, and I'm going to give a trigger warning because I think everybody, that's what we do now, and I do think it's important. But let's think about this. There's nothing more violent than dying by, I don't even like to use the word suicide anymore. I want us to, because I believe that those of us who do not make it out of the bipolar died from bipolar. I don't believe we died by suicide. Suicide is this sort of concept that somehow we make a choice and we decide to end our lives. Sometimes that is true with euthanasia or something. Let's say you have cancer and it's not getting better and you decide, I want to gently leave the world. But that's not what happens to us. That is not what happens to us. So there's nothing to me more violent than not being able to manage our mood swings. And when we take the illness takes it out on us by our own hand, but it's not us, right? And there's nothing more aggressive than the domestic violence that comes from, using cannabis, for example, with untreated bipolar, and then throwing something against the wall and scaring your child. I want to talk about this more because everyone is experiencing it. And how do I know this? Because they write me all day long in direct message and on my private groups, but nobody wants to put this in public. They don't want to write about it, but it's there, right? So what do you think? Why do you think we are having such a hard time talking honestly about the symptoms?
I think that's a great question, but I think it's largely due to like the heavy stigma that's attached to all of these mental health conditions. And like you said, we don't really talk about like the reality of the situation. And a lot of the times it's like with bipolar disorder specifically, like you had mentioned before, like people thought, oh, she's just creative, she's zany, she's
Or
unique,
she's just loud, or she's mean, or
Yeah, right. It's like overgeneralized, like, assumptions that we make. So we don't really, try to find like I wouldn't say the time, but that we wouldn't try to find like, ways that we can have honest conversations about it. And most of these things are really scary when a lot of people think about it, especially like the general public, where it's like,
Mhm.
oh, if I am diagnosed with this, like, will I be very violent or will this affect me or my family
Mhm.
in a negative way? So I think there's like, a lot of different variables when we think about it in terms of like having honest and open conversations and what that requires. But long like answer to your question, but
No,
I really think that it's the
absolutely.
stigma, you know.
I think that's one reason why since the beginning, I'm not a memoir writer. I might do it one day, but mostly I'm I'm a researcher in management, but everything that I do, I experience myself. And then I work with thousands and thousands of people who go through the same thing. And that's how you do research, right? One
Mhm.
reason I want to be so honest about what happens is so that people will not be so scared. I'll tell you a quick story. I helped raise my nephew. He's the most important person in my life. He's 21 now. He even wrote a little section of the second edition of Take Charge. And one day, he was about maybe 4, and I was driving him. I lived in Portland, Oregon, and he was strapped into the back of the seat in his car seat, everything normal. This was many years ago, by the way, so almost 20 years ago. So this doesn't happen anymore. And a driver flipped me off. So I chased him in my car, and I chased him a long way, and I got up behind him and I started honking at him and I was yelling at him and I was saying, you mom. And then I looked in my rearview mirror and there was my nephew going, oh,
Mm.
a little 4-year-old. And right there I went, I think I'm manic. It was dysphoric mania. And I think I need some kind of like inner kind of dialogue with myself because I just put my 4-year-old nephew in danger.
Mm.
That was an aggressive, violent, slightly homicidal, dysphoric manic episode. It was a reaction to a medication. I did figure out what was going on. It was a very long time ago. Every minute of it, I remember. I used to chase people with my car. I used to shake my fist at people. I used to threaten people. I would be out, and if somebody did something I didn't like, I'd bump up against them and say, take me on, take me on. Now,
Mm.
this didn't happen very often. It was extremely rare. And I remember going, did I just drink too much? And it scared me. I had no idea what was wrong. And
Mm.
I feel so lucky that I'm not dead. And my last big manic episode, because I do not allow mania in my life, the minute I feel any mania, everything in my life, including social media, shuts down. I use lithium orotate for my mania. I make sure my lithium is level. I get in a dark room. I write in my journal. I let people know what's going on, and I do not come out until my mania is gone. So
Mm.
my last manic episode, which was a long, long time ago, involved 2 men in a basement where one man almost killed another man and the police were called.
Mm.
So I want us to tell the truth. Hypersexuality combined with aggression, combined with drinking and or substances is the number one problem in our bipolar and psychotic disorder community right now. And if we're not going to talk about it, how are we going to deal with all of the violence we're seeing? Look at New York alone. And I really admire what Eric Adams is doing. And yet, when we look at the large organizations that are supposed to be helping us with these illnesses, they refuse to talk about this topic because of worry about stigma. Look
Mhm.
at, I mean, people can't see me, but they can hear me. I am not that person who chased somebody in that car. I am not the person who was in a room where somebody was getting beaten up. That was my bipolar. And I take responsibility for what happened because it was me, but it's only by talking about it honestly and managing it that for well over 25 years, nothing like that ever has happened and won't happen ever again. But I
Mhm.
had to be taught, how to manage. You were sharing earlier about, a manic episode where you were so excited and you're doing 10 years of planning in advance and all of this kind of stuff. We have to be taught that even though that might feel good, it's not good because the people around us, it drives them crazy. So
Mhm.
that's why I'm here. You can ask me anything. People can write me anything. They can ask me anything. I am not trying to say that all people with bipolar, schizoaffective, and schizophrenia are violent. I am saying all of us have the ability to be violent and aggressive if we don't manage our illness. Big difference. I do
Yeah.
not think we are violent people at heart, but these illnesses need to be managed carefully because they are brain illnesses about energy, and energy can be aggressive. And so that's sort of my soapbox about that topic. I want us to talk about it more. We need help.
Yes. Yes. No, I agree. And especially, I mean, we were talking earlier about like how I had my manic episode. And the thing is, it started off jovial, but then as
Oh,
it got severe, I was being aggressive. I was
ah,
saying a lot of vulgar things. And
vulgar. Isn't it shocking the sexually the words, the
yes.
porn, the thoughts, the
Mm-hmm.
things that are not us and are
Yeah.
very scary, and the way it twists our words.
Yes.
It's fascinating, but also,
Very
so you
dangerous.
started euphoric and then moved into the dysphoric, which is quite
Yeah.
common in a big episode, right?
Yeah, and it was happening like over the course of a couple days because it was like from December 31st all the way into January 4th. So January 4th was when I got hospitalized because it had gotten to the point where my mom and sister, God bless them, but my younger sister, she was witnessing it and she was just after that was just really traumatized by that whole ordeal. And it was just, a lot of like guilt and shame that came
Oh
after.
gosh, yeah. Because
When I
that's
came
not
home.
how we were raised, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's not like, because this is not a trauma illness, right? These symptoms don't come from something that happened to us in childhood. Now, does trauma affect it? Of course it does, but we can have those thoughts and those feelings and that aggression and that all of that with nothing ever happening. It's
True.
internally, created. It's so shocking, isn't it? It's like,
Mhm.
what?
Yeah,
What?
very shocking. And the funny thing is, that was actually one of my questions. Like, why is bipolar disorder so like hard to diagnose early on? Because even as after I got my diagnosis, I was looking back at different points in my life prior, and I'm like, you know what? I was probably hypomanic.
Oh, absolutely. You were hypo. Yeah. Bipolar is not difficult to diagnose. And so I actually teach. Most of my work is done in private. So anybody listening to this, they'll see my Instagram and my websites and my books and all that. But my main work is done off of two very private groups on Facebook, one called The Stable Bed, and that's for partners and healthcare professionals who work with partners, and The Stable Table, and that's for family, caregivers, and healthcare professionals who work with family. And that includes siblings, grandparents, etc. You would not believe all of the information that's all on there. And so that's a big part of my research as well, right? So I get about, I'd say 100 comments or DMs every 2 days. So usually about 50 a day. It's a ton, right? Every single person who writes me and says, my loved one was diagnosed later in life. And I'll say probably they were diagnosed later in life, but there's a very, very good chance that the hypomania had been there all along. There are some where it hasn't, and that means that a substance then has brought out the bipolar, because you can have naturally occurring bipolar like mine, or substance-induced bipolar where the genetics were latent and the bipolar flipped them on, the concept of epigenetics. That's what we're seeing with cannabis, meth. We see it with antidepressants, steroids. And that's my chapter, the Bipolar Significance 7 chapter that's in the new edition of Take Charge. So bipolar tends to start around age 17, and you're usually diagnosed with bipolar 1 because it's so intense, everyone sees it, 17 to 21. But within there, we have a lot of, creativity, or weekends we couldn't get out of bed. And then just like my description of what my life was like before I was diagnosed. But bipolar is not difficult to diagnose. If a healthcare professional takes a family history, and I'll ask you those questions real quick, and then gets you to write your memories from birth until now of your energy, bipolar is very easy to diagnose. So to diagnose bipolar, the first thing a professional needs to do is ask these questions. So Sarah, do you have a family history of bipolar disorder?
I am not sure.
So a lot of people, when they say that, next question, were you adopted?
No.
Okay. Do you have contact with your grandparents on either side?
Well, only on my mom's side.
Okay. On your mom's side, was there anybody who had anxiety or depression that you know about?
Not that I know of, no.
Does anybody such as your mother, father, or sister have depression or anxiety?
Yeah.
Okay. Is there alcoholism in the family tree?
No.
Is there, on the side you don't know much about, anything that might lead to the idea that there is some kind of mood swing, some kind of drug use, alcohol use, disappearing, jail, or anything like that?
Yeah, most likely.
Those are the questions. And we don't ask those questions to be negative. There's no negativity here. There's nothing negative about having bipolar. So if you had asked me in 1995 when I was diagnosed if there was bipolar in my family tree, I'd say, I have no idea. I don't even know what this is. Blah, blah, blah. Now, grandfather, father, close family member, cousins, two cousins, and myself, absolutely bipolar, 100%. And my grandfather and father were never diagnosed. And yet, many affairs, jobs, alcohol, picking up and leaving, having one relationship, leaving, lots of new ideas, super brilliant, careers that they would stop and start, a lot of new hobbies that stopped and started, doing one thing for let's say a couple of years, and then deciding you don't want to do it anymore, whatever. Uncle who's in jail, cousins who went to jail, cousins who were just moody, and then me. I have a very strong family history of bipolar. That's why my nephew, the one who was in the back of the car, who's one of my best friends, was raised in an environment where bipolar is totally discussed. He knows that if he uses weed, there's a very good chance it'll pop bipolar out if he's got the genetics. He's already had depression and anxiety, but no bipolar at age 21. So we think we really sort of dodged a substance-induced bipolar because he has ADD, he's had depression and anxiety, but no antidepressants, no et cetera. So it sounds like me, like you're the same as me. On my mom's side, there is no bipolar, none. There is anxiety and depression and not even any alcoholism. But you hit my dad's side. Whoa, because it usually only comes from one side, right? Then the next questions are, Were you considered an upbeat, bubbly person at certain times, and at other times, did you isolate yourself a little bit and step back from the world a little bit and wonder what's wrong?
Ooh, you put me on blast, but
Well, I'm
yes.
not necessarily having to say it to you, but
Yeah.
a good diagnostician, I have a course that's called Get the Diagnosis Right. And we
Mhm.
create documentation. And my co-author, John, who is one of my best friends, he died of cancer in 2020, but he taught me everything about how he diagnosed and medications. That's why our books are so amazing. I wrote the books, but he did the medication part of the book and taught me all of this stuff. And he was one of my best friends. He
Mm,
taught me that it's these questions that make it very easy to diagnose bipolar, because
right.
without mania, there is no bipolar, and it's not hard to figure mania. See, I get very excited about this, so I don't want to ask you too many questions, but those are the things that you would ask yourself before age 20. Were there times where I noticed a shift in energy, or hearing things or seeing things that weren't there, or that people commented on what's up with you, or how's it going, or I even said to myself, what just happened? That
Mm,
almost always is the beginning of the bipolar that then pops out fully when you're 20.
wow. Because honestly, no, I didn't mean like you were putting me on the spot, but I meant like it was so accurate because literally to answer that question, all throughout high school, it's like some moments, like people be like, "Oh, she's so bubbly, so jovial." Like my laugh, people can attest to this. Like I have a
Wow.
very loud laugh.
Yeah, beautiful smile.
So yeah, oh, thank you.
Mhm.
But yeah, people would see that and they're like, "Oh, she's so happy, she's so upbeat." But then, like literally, sometimes I would like cut some friends out, or I would isolate
There, oh,
myself.
there you
Yeah.
go. 100%.
Hmm.
I I look back now and especially having it for 15 years, especially as women, because we, and actually I should, because I mean, men and women have bipolar in the same, but I would always say, I'm just going through changes. I'm
Yeah.
just going through changes, or either I'm growing, I'm changing. And I hurt so many people. I left so many people, and it was not intentional.
Mm,
But all of us with bipolar, as far as I need to be careful. The majority of us with bipolar, especially if we're diagnosed in mid 20s, 30s, 40s, can look back and see, unless it's substance induced, the mood swings were there. They just had not fully expressed themselves to the point that we needed hospitalization or
mm.
medication for them yet.
Yeah, wow. I would
Mhm.
I would ask a follow-up question to that. So, how does suppression play a role? Because speaking for myself, I used to just suppress all these like intense emotions. Like I would like feel like the anger intensely, the sadness intensely, but then I would just stuff it down and move on. So, how does that like intensify the bipolar
Until you
disorder?
couldn't, until you couldn't.
Yeah.
Bipolar will always express itself, always. And so here's the difference between, let's say, maybe something that might be trauma based. That, let's say, for example, you had a very rough experience, or somebody had, they had an experience that led to symptoms of fear and worry and anger and depression. Those will come and go in a different way. They will be attached to a specific event. They will have a reason behind them. Us, oh my gosh, these mood swings, they just sort of come out of nowhere. We eventually can't suppress them. That's why the diagnosis happens.
Mhm.
So either we start to express them in a way and others get upset with us and we end up getting pregnant, or we travel too much, or we get somebody else pregnant, or we get an STD, or we leave a job, or we upset people. We might not get diagnosed, but it's there, right? It's
Mm,
right in front of our face. We just don't know what it is. Or we get so sick, we end up in the hospital and we have to be diagnosed, especially
mm,
those of us with a lot of psychosis. So I do not think we suppress our symptoms at all. I think they express themselves to everyone, but do we self medicate them
yeah.
with alcohol, me, food, substances? It used to be alcohol, now it's food, with
Same.
sexual relationships, with travel, with leaving, with, let's say, getting something new, trying something new, going somewhere new. And it's not even conscious suppression. We're just trying to feel better. I can smell bipolar disorder. My mom sort of laughs at me because I've done quite a bit of research about physical signs of bipolar, like mania in the eyes and all this. But I also
Mm,
feel that bipolar has an essence, it has an energy. And so many of us with bipolar are bipolar magnets. And that means people who have bipolar come to us. We meet them. We recognize them. We party with them. We hang out with them. We get in relationships with them because, so I guess smell is not the right word. It's more like I sense the bipolar. I can tell if someone's manic. It's a different energy, right? So we're actually not suppressing it. We are not yet aware of it. And that's the lack of insight. That's our biggest problem in these illnesses, because we know something's wrong, but we can't imagine what it is. And then if someone says it's bipolar, we cannot reconcile that.
Yeah.
Me, a mental illness? I don't think so. So we think maybe I'm just not a good person, or maybe I'm an alcoholic, and then it's bipolar all along. So
Yeah.
great question. It's complicated, isn't it? This is
Very.
an illness that affects the neurotransmitters and the parts of the brain, hormones, all of this that affect and regulate emotions, anger, irritation. It regulates sleep. No
Yeah.
wonder we have a hard time. It's the most complex, fascinating illness. I am infinitely fascinated by us. We are infinitely fascinating, aren't we?
No,
Infinitely
I
fascinating.
agree. I agree, most definitely. And I
Mhm.
also love like your research, especially like in Take Charge of Bipolar Disorder specifically, because I was telling you earlier, that's one of the first books that they recommended to me when I was leaving the hospital. And in reading that book, I even read it with my mom and sister because they were interested in like, just learning more and making sure that I don't have another manic episode like as severe as it was before.
Mhm.
So I just really love the fact that you kind of involved the caretakers and the support system within the book. And I just wanted to know like what was like your thought process behind like incorporating the support system and the caregivers along with your research.
Well, it had never been done before, because it was interesting, because when I wrote Take Charge, which was the first edition, second edition just came out, but the first edition was 2005. It actually was my third book. And so I had written my health cards, which are my management system. Then I had written Loving Someone with Bipolar Disorder. And that was the first ever book for partners. Now there's thousands of them. There had never been a book for partners who had a loved one with a brain illness, not for epilepsy, not for diabetes, not for schizophrenia, not for bipolar. Never happened.
Oh
That was the
wow.
first one. I think that experience is what makes my work so different. I fell in love with somebody who had bipolar, not knowing he had it or I had it. He's an amazing man from France. We met in Tokyo, where I had moved when I was manic and he had moved when he was manic. And we had no idea. And for a couple years, there's no question, I was having a lot of symptoms, but he's quite a bit younger than me and he had not had many symptoms. We had no idea we both had bipolar. Looking back, of course, we can see it. And his dad had bipolar and my dad had bipolar. We
Wow.
didn't know, right? Now, his dad had been diagnosed. So my introduction to bipolar was as a partner. I
Mhm.
wasn't diagnosed until a year after he was diagnosed. And interestingly, my bipolar is so different from his because I had not quite developed into bipolar 1. Mine had always I have bipolar 1 now, but bipolar 2 is what I had, so I only had hypomania. So when I saw his full-blown mania, which is what you experienced, when you went to the hospital, I said, I've never been sick like that. I have since, but at the time I hadn't. Then when it came time to write Take Charge, I was like, I have to put information for parents and partners in there and healthcare professionals, because we're the ones who take care of the people when they're sick.
Right.
This is what's so shocking to me still, that healthcare professionals, and I love many healthcare professionals, but the majority of them are so tied in by these insurance companies or by managed care or National Health Service in other countries for 20 minutes and 30-minute time with a loved one. There's no way they're coming and talking to your sister or your mom or your partner. They don't have
Mhm.
time. So someone had to do it. And that's why my work is so focused on that experience.
Wow. Wow. I appreciate that most definitely. And that aspect of your research has really like helped not only like so many families, but my family personally to
That's
kind of just
wonderful.
understand.
So what advice do you have? So how old are you? Because I think I'm like 40 years. I feel like I'm 40 years older than you. I don't feel old, but I'm almost 60. How old are you?
I'm 24.
So at age 24, so you're a Gen Z millennial, right? Which is some of the greatest people who ever walked the earth. And I really mean this because my nephew, who's Gen Z, you guys just sort of don't take any junk from people, right? You're much more open, and people of the 80s, we were pretty amazing too. I'm an 80s kid. but we didn't have the outlets you have. What
Mm.
is your best advice for somebody your age on their way to their first career, maybe having a new family, on their way to college, and darn it, that bipolar diagnosis comes in? Are you kidding me? What? I don't get to go be a Rhodes Scholar and go and travel for 15 years like I wanted. I can't go join the Peace Corps. I'm about to have a baby and you're telling me I have bipolar. What
Mm.
advice do you have as a person who got a pretty early diagnosis? How are you doing it? What's your advice?
Wow. Honestly, I would say it's a lot of prayer.
And in fact,
Because
I read about that spiritual aspect about you. So tell me more about that. How does that spiritual aspect help you? And I don't even like the word accept the diagnosis, because whether we accept it or not, Sarah, it's in our brain. We
right,
have it. I mean,
right.
it's almost like we never say, do you accept your diabetes? We know if you have diabetes or epilepsy or bipolar. So how did the spirituality and faith keep you going?
Yeah, so honestly, I always like grew up in a Christian household, and so just like being like in that type of environment kind of gave me the tools to like, seek God in the midst of my trials and tribulations. And I'm not gonna lie, like were moments where I was like, God, what is going on? Like, why would you give this to me? Like, why am I diagnosed with this? I had so many questions, but the thing for me is not like the rituals. Like, yes, they're important, and praying and fasting, reading the Bible, that's all important. But for me, it's really the hope that is
Yes.
behind the faith, because for me it's like my hope is in Jesus, and because of that hope, that's what keeps me going even on the days where I feel like it's so low for me. And I will say those depressing moments in bipolar, it's extreme. And
It's
so
excruciating.
yeah, and so it's just like I use that hope to just kind of move me forward and to say, you know what, this is a low moment. And it also helps me to realize that, hey, this is for a purpose. Yeah, it may feel like, okay, this is useless now in the moment, but I know that someday I'm going to be like, talking to someone about this and sharing my experience and just offering that same hope that I have to them. So for me, it's more of like the hope and the purpose behind like just knowing, okay, yes, I'm going through this now, but it is going to be used for a greater purpose. At least that's like what the Christian faith has taught me as a Christian myself, but it's really the hope for me that keeps me going.
Mhm. Well, I think in Christianity, of course, the hope message is, of course, one of hope. And yet, this is an illness that has a symptom of hopelessness.
Mm,
Do you feel that faith supports you during those hopeless times?
yes,
And
absolutely.
like you can rest in it, for example, and just say, I'm in pain. This is the illness. I will get through this. I know who I am. So, how do we help people who don't have as much insight, of course, because that's insight? You have the insight. We have the insight that we're depressed and they're in their lowest moment. They might not even be ready to talk about bipolar. And they might be listening to this because they want to learn something new. Someone has mentioned it. They don't know if they have it. What advice do you have to reach out to get help when you're in that low moment and you don't have that kind of spiritual support or that ability? What's our first step to reach out for help?
I would say, like, I always say this, but I would say, like, your diagnosis or the thing that you're dealing with is not indicative of who you are as a person. Like, I feel like that's the first step. Like, once you recognize, listen, this is just like a mental health condition that I am going through right now, and this is just a low moment that was spurred on by whatever it is, right? But recognizing that just because you're going through tough things doesn't make you a bad person inherently. And that's something that even I've had to like grasp myself, because when I was first diagnosed, I was like, great, I guess I'm just defective now. Like my
Ah,
character is just bad. And so getting to realize that that doesn't make you a bad person, I feel like that's the first step to coming to that realization that, you know what, I should ask for help. And the second thing I would say is don't be afraid or ashamed to say, I need help. Even
Right.
if you don't know what you need help with, just be like to someone, like anybody who's trusted, or, a mental health professional. Or if you're not even there yet to go to like a straight up mental health professional, but at least somebody in your corner that you can trust and you know that you can depend on, just say, hey, look, I need help with this. Like, like
It's
just
too
to
much
try
for
to
me
reach
right
out.
now. That's right.
Yeah.
It's too much for me right now. I have to, I mean, like I said, I keep saying I'm almost 60 because it's sort of shocking because I literally started my journey with this when I was 30. That's when Ivan was diagnosed. And then I was diagnosed at 31. And I can't believe it's been 30 years. I'm still learning. I still get sick like that. I still get suicidal. I still have to ask. I still get manic. I still get psychotic. It's just not like as bad as it was in the past. And I know what to do. I've had to train the people around me on what to do so that when they see me, like not even being able to, I just had a reaction to a medication that I was taking that had nothing to do with bipolar. And oh, it made me depressed. I was so depressed, Sarah. I have my head, and people can't see me. So what I'm doing is my head gets really heavy, and my head will go down and my chin almost goes to my chest because the depression is so physical. It's so overwhelming. And during all of that, I was like, something's not right. This is depression. Something's going on. What's the trigger? And it took me almost a week to figure out it was a medication I was taking. And then it took another week to get the medication out of my system. It was bad. It was a bad reaction. But my mom, through the whole thing, and everybody who knew me, I can tell you're depressed. What can I do? Are you suicidal? She asked me that all the time. And I was like, this is interesting. I'd say, Mom, this is interesting, but this episode is not a suicidal psychotic depression. So the substance, it was something for diabetes, to prevent diabetes. I don't have diabetes, but whatever was in that substance that was affecting the part of my brain made me depressed, but not psychotic. So it wasn't a hallucinogenic, that kind of thing. But I have a system in place. So if somebody is new and listening to this and maybe just diagnosed, etc., what I think they can hear from the both of us is that you and I have a system. We have an internal system, which is, this is a downswing. This is mania. This is psychosis. I don't give in to that. I know what I need to do. I have books I can read. I can ask for help. But we also have the people around us who have educated themselves, who will say, hey, I think there's a little mania here. Or actually, nope, that's paranoia. Nobody's trying to harm you and there's nobody following you, and not in a bad way. So it starts with an internal quest for feeling better and not dying. And then the beautiful thing is, and I think you've probably experienced this, most people want to help.
Yes.
It's shocking to me how many people I work with, because I work with webmasters and I have a manager and all this. I can say to them, the bipolar is really rough today. And they'll go, okay. And even somebody I work with sent me a picture of flowers from her garden today because she knew I'd been having a tough time. This is someone I work with. And they're not making me feel bad. I get embarrassed because I'll feel weak and I'll feel like I'm supposed to be the boss here and I'm the weak one. And I'm like, no, that's not weakness. It's not weakness to say you need help. It's not weakness to spend a couple days in bed. It's not weakness to cry. It's not weakness to be suicidal. It's no different than epilepsy or diabetes or migraines or MS or anything. And that's what I have to remind myself. And I hope that message gets across to people, that we have to be internally there for ourselves to say, I need help, and then reach out, because people will not reject us. Isn't it amazing that people do not reject us when we ask for help?
People that care do not.
The people who care. Well, now I'm saying we have to ask the right people. We're not going to go ask a stranger or someone who's mean for us, but someone who's in our life, we're us asking help. They'll be like, of course I'll help. Call me anytime. Then you know our illness though. She didn't really mean it. I'm not going to call her. I'm just going to lie in bed and I'm not going to, so you have to fight the whole time, this isolation that it gives you. But I have found that as long as we are a willing participant in our own care, people want to help us. I think that's very true.
No, that's definitely true. I mean, it brought me back to when I was first home from the hospital. Everybody, my phone was blowing up. They were just like, "Are you okay? Are you okay? We heard." Like, are you okay?
How did people talk to you? Did you say I was diagnosed with bipolar and you just told everybody?
I just told a few people, to be
I
honest.
told everybody because I literally was like, finally, I have some answers. I'm not crazy. It's bipolar. And I told everybody, it never entered my mind not to tell people. I was so excited I had an answer. I was like,
Wow.
yes.
I mean, I was still dealing with like the shame of like, oh man, what are people gonna think about me, and
Ah.
all that types of stuff. But I did tell like my close friends, close family members, so they knew,
And
and they
what
were.
was their response? How did they respond? Did they know what it was? Did they ask you questions? How did they respond?
So they did ask me questions because they're like, okay, I don't want to make assumptions. Please tell me what happened.
Bravo.
Yeah, I'm just like, oh, okay.
Uh-huh.
And honestly, I didn't even have the language to like say what I was experiencing. And that's why it's like your book was so integral for that, because then I could pinpoint and be like, oh, yeah, I was like, having a severe manic episode. Like, I'm using the language now,
The language,
but
yeah.
before
Mhm.
I was like, well, I did a lot of like embarrassing things. And they were like, okay,
Mhm.
so how did you get from there to the hospital? Like, I'm confused, so yeah, it took some
Wonderful.
time.
Absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
So, how did you navigate social media during that episode? Did your mania come out on social media? Because one thing I will say about being older, I cannot imagine if there had been cameras when I was undiagnosed. I would truly be scared if there had been cameras. And so, how did you navigate that?
Well, honestly, the funny thing is I wasn't really on social media
Ah,
aside from like my blog, because it's a hilarious story. But during like my euphoric state of mania, I wrote an entire like movie review
of course you did.
of one of the Twilight films, the second
Oh
one.
wow, that's I love Twilight. I love Twilight so much. Oh, I love Twilight.
Yes. So I wrote that whole thing, published it. That's the thing that I put on social media. But
That's awesome.
I read the caption of that post. I even took so many screenshots while I was manic. I'm like, I have to document everything. And I read the caption, I'm just like, ooh, it's like an entire run-on sentence. Start to finish.
And yet when we're doing it, we feel like a genius, and this is the greatest review of all time. This is going to get me noticed, and maybe they'll ask me to write a movie, and every.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, ooh. I mean, the article itself was pretty, like, it was pretty well written, but like the caption on the social media post was just like insane. I was like, should I take this down? No. And I tagged so many people. Like, I tagged all of my friends who I knew that liked Twilight. It was a mess, but
But I think you're pretty lucky then that even though that is very funny and maybe slightly embarrassing, you can live through that. That's
yes, exactly. Especially the aftermath. I'm like, you know
yes.
what? It's a funny story looking back at it, but yeah. But well, Julie, I just want to thank you so much for joining me. It was an
We could just talk all
amazing.
night.
I know we might need a part two. I
I
don't
know it's
know,
absolutely wonderful. I just loved learning about you, and you have so much to offer, Sarah. You have, somebody of your age to be able to talk like this. I'm thinking about what it would have been like for me when I was flunking out of college, when no one knew what was going on, when I was throwing those glasses in the woods, and my boyfriend leaving me and me thinking of dying on my bicycle. I had nothing. And now you're the same age as I was then. Look how far we've come.
yeah,
This is beautiful. And this is the positive, beautiful thing about social media, that social media has been wonderful in many ways for bipolar,
yeah,
because we're not in the shadows anymore. There's millions of us. It's the
right,
same illness all over the world. It's ancient. It's
yeah.
thousands of years old. And now we're talking about it openly. So thank you. It's pretty wonderful.
Yes, and thank you so much for joining me. I was honored by this
Thank you.
conversation.
And I'm honored. I'm honored to talk to you as well with all your work.
Oh my gosh. Don't make me cry. But I do have one final question. One final one.
Absolutely.
So, what advice or words of encouragement do you have for someone who is struggling to manage bipolar disorder?
The first thing to remember is that bipolar disorder is a sleep disorder. I had a friend who had a very famous psychiatrist, and he and Kay Redfield, his name is Dr. Goodwin, and he and Kay Redfield Jameson, who wrote Unquiet Mind, wrote one of the most definitive psychiatric books on manic depression. And he actually, I don't want to take credit because he's the one who said this. He said, one day we will see bipolar for what it is, a sleep disorder. And then a couple years later, one of the big, a Nobel Prize came out for 3 scientists who sort of explained a lot about the circadian rhythm. So bipolar is a circadian rhythm illness. My best advice is that you must look at your sleep, and sleep is affected by triggers. So if you want to read about it, the new edition of Take Charge of Bipolar Disorder has a triggers chapter. I created the triggers list that's used all over the world now. And that was based off of living for 10 years with someone with bipolar, myself with bipolar, family with bipolar, and then working with tens of thousands of people all over the world and comments. It's a list that we all experience. And the number one thing on there is substances, because substances not only affect our neurotransmitters, but they affect sleep. The next thing is shift work, traveling to new time zones, and not having a regular sleep schedule. So if you're a nurse, for example, who works the 3 to 11 shift, and then it switches the next week to 6 a.m. to 2, and then it switches, your bipolar cannot survive it. So if you are like, the meds aren't working well enough and I don't know what to do, get out that triggers list and start to change anything that affects sleep. It's going to be hard at first because you're like, what? I can't work at night if I want to stay stable? Nope. Very rare for someone with bipolar that's having trouble with bipolar to be a bartender, for example. And I'm not talking about the alcohol, it's just the hours. It's very rare for us to be in a high stress job and stay stable because it affects our sleep. It is rare for us to use drugs. Oh, actually, we use drugs all the time. It's rare for us to handle drugs. You know, some people can use drugs on the weekend and it will make us sick. So my best piece of advice, if you're struggling and you want to manage, is learn your triggers and calmly say to myself, in bed by 11, up by 7, which is the natural melatonin, serotonin, circadian rhythm balance. When I changed, and all my friends knew because I was a heavy partier, when I changed that I'm always home or I leave the bar or the club by 11 p.m., they would stay and party till 2 or 3. My whole life changed. So I would party with them, no drinking or anything, but have fun with them, happy hour. Then we'd have, hang out, 8, do karaoke or whatever, and I'm done by 11. I was able to have a life and not be sick. Now, could I have done that when I was 19? I don't know. It's easier when you're 40, right? But sleep, it's a circadian rhythm illness. The more we manage our sleep, the more we manage our triggers, the less meds we need. And I find that very, very hopeful. I manage almost all of my mania through sleep management.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. It was so informative. It was so amazing. We might do a part 2 if that's okay with you. Oh, awesome. So
absolutely, anytime.
Oh, thank you. Oh my gosh, guys, I'm fangirling, but thank you so much, Julie. I will link all of your books and your social media and everything in the show notes. And everyone stay tuned for more empowering episodes on Rough Edges. Thank you for listening to Rough Edges. This podcast is available on Spotify, Anchor, Apple Podcast, iHeartRadio, and more. For more updates on the Rough Edges podcast, please follow on Instagram at rough.edges.podcast. You can also visit the official podcast website at www.roughedgespodcast.com. If you have any questions or further suggestions for how this podcast can grow, please email at rough.edges.podcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening and have a wonderful day.